Straight up. Glory to God. Welcome back to Way Happy Bible Study. We are in the book of Daniel by special request from several of you. I think it's really important. It's God's will when that happens. It's important to understand this information, especially if the sixth seal does open July 27th, like is a possibility, not a certainty. We don't do predictions around here. We do scriptural possibilities, and we rule them out when we can. Now, some of you that haven't been around for a while, you may not realize we have previously, quite some time ago actually, ruled out the 9th of Av as went for the temple to be defiled. It's not going to be defiled on the 9th of Av according to Daniel's equation. The 9th of Av this year is too soon. There is no temple. So the 9th of Av this year is out, and the 9th of Av next year is too late. So right now we show that on the timeline, the defiling of the temple around January 20th, 2019. And then the final blood moon of the triad, the final blood moon of the series of 7 falls January 21st, the very next day of 2019. So there is where, that's the very latest, according to Daniel's equation, that the temple can be defiled. And that is nowhere near the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av next year, there's just not enough days left for it to be the midpoint. The very, very latest the midpoint can start, according to Daniel's equation, is January 20th. That's the very latest. Okay? That's the very furthest out that this can go and still fit within the solution to Daniel's equation. And we will go through that at some point. But we'll wait till we get to that point in Daniel to explain all of that. Right now we're in Daniel chapter 1. And we're starting up again in this segment in verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? He's this eunuch who cares about Daniel and takes care of him, is worried that their health will suffer if they don't eat the meat. Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. He's saying, if you start looking like you're not being nourished and fed like the rest, I'm going to be in trouble. In verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Now this is plants, vegetables. It's a vegetarian diet. And water rather than wine. In verse 13, then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, saying, let us do this 10 days, and then you judge at the end of the 10 days whether or not we are just as healthy as those who are eating the meat. And the countenance of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest deal with thy servants. So he's saying, if we look peaked to you and we look like we're not as healthy as the others after 10 days, then we will do as you ask. In verse 14, so he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So not only did they look just as healthy, they looked healthier than the others who were eating the meat. In verse 16, thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. They ate salads and fruits and vegetables. In verse 7, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. God gave them, okay? He gave that to them. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. See, Joseph had understanding of dreams by God's design as well. In verse 18, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 19, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. How about that? In verse 21, and Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. In chapter 2, verse 1. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. So he wasn't able to sleep. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. In verse 3 of chapter 2 of Daniel. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. So he's forgotten his dream, even though he's still troubled by it, but he's forgotten it. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. Uh-oh. It's not going to be good enough to hear the king's dream and interpret it. Now the king is actually putting them on the line saying, you tell me the dream and the interpretation. If you're really wise and intuitive like you claim, you can do this. And they were all scared to death because they knew they couldn't do it. In verse 6, but if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. In verse 7, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. See, they don't know how to tell him what he dreamed and forgot. In verse 8, the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. Smart king, isn't he? The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asked such things at any magician or astrologers or Chaldean. He's saying, They're telling the king there is nobody on the planet who can do that. Okay? Therefore, there's nobody, no king ever asked that kind of thing of his servants. In verse 11, and it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. In verse 12, for this cause the king was angry and very furious. They're supposed to be knowledgeable about these kind of things, but they're liars. And commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He's like, what good are you guys? Away with you. It's kind of like off with their heads kind of thing. In chapter 2, verse 13, and the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. In verse 14, then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. In verse 15, he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. Remember, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 18 of Daniel chapter 2, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. God is showing him the dream and the interpretation. In verse 20, Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. In verse 21, and he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. In verse 22, he revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Verse 24, therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. In verse 25, then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. In verse 26, the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? In verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. They can't do it. In verse 28, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. So see, God has shown Daniel the dream, the interpretation, and even when it is supposed to take place. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. In verse 29, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. In verse 30, but as for me, This secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. In verse 31, thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. In verse 32, this image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. In verse 34, thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Jesus is that stone that is cut out without hands. And he will appear in the latter days and destroy that final kingdom that is represented by the feet and toes of iron and clay. In verse 36, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. In verse 37, thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. In verse 38, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. In verse 40, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. In verse 41, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. In verse 42, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. But they shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Now this is interesting. The head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. The second kingdom was Medo-Persia, represented by the chest and arms of silver. Then you had the belly and thighs of brass, represented by the kingdom of Alexander the Great. Now keep in mind, all of these particular kingdoms rise in that same exact geographical area of the world where Babylon stood, then where Medo-Persia stood, and then where the Greek Empire, headed by Alexander the Great, stood. Alexander died, and his kingdom was broken up into 4 pieces. It was huge. And then the fourth piece, administrated by Seleucus, Alexander's king was broken up into 4 sections, and the section belonging to Seleucus, his general, became the Roman Empire next, after that. And the Roman Empire is the legs of iron. And then the feet of iron and miry clay is represented by the revived Roman Empire, which is the EU superstate, which will have 10 kings that have no kingdom as yet. But they will, once the New World Order is established and Satan is here and the Antichrist is empowered and on the throne of the earth. Now, we haven't got to that explanation yet, but I'm just giving you a clue before we get there. In verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. That's the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. That comes after the EU superstate and the 10 kings who have no kingdom as yet. In verse 45, and so that the New World Order will reign during the second half, and then Jesus will reign once he takes it down. In verse 45, for as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, this is Jesus, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. In verse 46, then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face, and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him, because I'll bet he was really shocked that Daniel was able to tell him not only what he dreamed, but also the interpretation of it. In verse 47, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Nebuchadnezzar knew when he heard Daniel's interpretation, when he heard Daniel tell what his dream was, he knew that that was the truth. In verse 48, then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Have you noticed that when a man follows the Lord and is pleasing to the Lord puts him in charge over the enemy nation? Just as Joseph was made governor of Egypt, now you have Daniel being placed in a high position over the citizens of Babylon on Nebuchadnezzar's behalf. And he was the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. In verse 49, then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, finally calling them that, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Wow, our time is already up. When we come back on Wednesday, we will start in Daniel chapter 3, and we'll also do some more of our Proverbs. I love you guys. Thanks for studying with me tonight. God bless you. And should the Lord tarry, we'll see you Wednesday, here, there, or in the air. Straight up.